Welcome back to the channel. For 12 years, a man broke into homes across California in the middle of the night. He would study a household for days, sometimes weeks, before making his move. He knew which door was left unlocked. He knew what time the family went to sleep. He knew, before he ever set foot inside, exactly how the night would unfold. He terrorized more than a dozen communities across 2 regions of the state, leaving behind more than 40 documented sexual assaults and at least 13 murders. Then, in 1986, he simply stopped. No arrest. He didn't get caught. He didn't die. He just disappeared, as completely as if he had never existed at all. For the next 42 years, investigators across dozens of California police departments chased a man who left behind an overwhelming amount of physical evidence and almost no way to identify who he actually was. Task forces formed and disbanded. A journalist spent years of her life obsessed with finding him and died before she ever got the answer. Thousands of men were investigated, questioned, and cleared. And the entire time, the man responsible was living an ordinary life less than a few hours from where it all happened. Married, raising children, working a stable job, blending in so completely that almost nobody who knew him ever gave him a second thought. Then, in a laboratory, using a tool that had nothing to do with law enforcement at all, someone finally found him. This is the story of the Golden State Killer and the 4 decades it took to learn his name. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. We cover real cold cases every week, cases where the truth waited years, sometimes decades to come out, and where court records, guilty pleas, and official investigations eventually tell us exactly what happened, no matter how long it takes. And if you're already subscribed, tap that like button. It helps this story reach more people who only know the nickname and never heard the full story behind it. Now back to Sacramento, California, the summer of 1976. The first confirmed attack took place on June 18, 1976, in Rancho Cordova, a quiet suburb of Sacramento. A man broke into a home and sexually assaulted a woman while she was alone inside, in an attack that gave almost no useful evidence to the officers who responded, and that at the time seemed like an isolated, if disturbing, single incident. Over the following months, similar attacks began piling up across the greater Sacramento area, and then spread into nearby Stockton and other Northern California communities, following a pattern that grew increasingly difficult for local police to dismiss as unrelated. Investigators started referring to the man responsible as the East Area Rapist, based on the general region where his early crimes were concentrated, a name that would remain attached to the case for years before anyone understood its true, much larger scope. His method was disturbingly consistent. He would select a target, often a home in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood, and spend days or even weeks observing it beforehand, learning the residents' schedules, identifying entry points, and sometimes returning to the property multiple times before ever making contact. He frequently entered homes in advance of an actual attack, leaving small signs of his presence: items moved, doors unlocked, twine left in drawers for later use, apparently as a way of asserting control and instilling fear even before the assault itself took place. Some victims later recalled a sense of unease in the days leading up to an attack, small details out of place that they had dismissed at the time, only to realize afterward that someone had already been inside their home. In his earliest attacks, he targeted women who lived alone. Later, his pattern shifted to include couples, where he would bind the male partner, place stacked dishes on his back, and threaten to kill both victims if he heard the dishes fall, while he assaulted the woman in another room. This particular detail, the dishes, the whispered threats, The extended, methodical nature of each attack became one of the clearest signatures investigators eventually used to link cases together across different jurisdictions. By the time investigators had connected a meaningful string of these cases together, he had already struck dozens of times across an ever-widening area of Northern California. By 1977, the East Area Rapist had become one of the most urgent and most frustrating cases Northern California law enforcement had ever dealt with. Entire neighborhoods changed their behavior. Residents installed extra locks, motion sensor lights, and alarm systems. Gun sales in affected communities reportedly spiked. Local newspapers ran regular updates on the case, and rumors spread quickly through communities about who might be responsible, often implicating entirely innocent local men based on nothing more than a vague physical resemblance to inconsistent witness descriptions. Community patrol groups formed in some neighborhoods, with residents taking turns watching the streets at night, a level of organized public fear rarely seen in response to a single unidentified offender. Despite the sheer number of attacks, eventually more than 40 in the Sacramento and Stockton areas alone, investigators struggled to build a case. The attacker wore a mask during his assaults, rarely spoke above a whisper, and left almost no reliable physical description behind. He appeared to have detailed knowledge of police procedure and forensic evidence collection, at times seeming to deliberately avoid leaving fingerprints, and occasionally taunting investigators directly, in ways that suggested he understood exactly how a criminal investigation worked from the inside. Starting in early 1978, some of his earlier victims began receiving disturbing, threatening phone calls, apparently from the attacker himself, taunting them years after their assaults and, in some cases, threatening to kill them. Those calls, chillingly, continued intermittently for years, in one case reportedly continuing all the way into the 2000s. By the late 1970s, the sheer scale of the East Area Rapist case forced multiple Sacramento area police departments to form a joint task force, an unusual level of cooperation for the era, when most departments still operated with limited technology and almost no shared digital record-keeping between jurisdictions. Detectives compiled thick binders of case files, cross-referencing witness statements, physical evidence, and behavioral patterns by hand. Composite sketches were updated repeatedly as new witnesses came forward, though the attacker's consistent use of a mask meant even these updated sketches offered only a general impression rather than anything close to a reliable likeness. Some investigators who worked the case in its earliest years would go on to spend the rest of their careers, and in a few cases their retirements, still thinking about the one case they were never able to close. By 1979, the pattern of attacks in Northern California appeared to stop, but in Southern California, a nearly identical string of crimes had already begun, this time escalating into outright murder. Investigators in Santa Barbara, Ventura, Orange, and other Southern California counties began linking a series of brutal home invasion murders dating back to 1979 to a killer they dubbed the original Night Stalker. Victims were typically found bound and beaten to death inside their own homes, often couples, killed together in attacks that showed the same meticulous planning and apparent surveillance that had defined the East Area Rapist crimes further north. For years, these Southern California murders and the Northern California assaults were treated by investigators as entirely separate cases, handled by different police departments in different counties, with no coordinated effort to compare notes. It would take more than 2 decades and the arrival of far more advanced DNA testing before investigators definitively confirmed that the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were, in fact, the exact same person. In 2001, DNA analysis formally linked the two sets of crimes together for the first time, confirming what some investigators had long suspected but had never been able to prove. It was around this same period that true crime writer Michelle McNamara began referring to the combined case using a new name of her own invention, the Golden State Killer. What made the Southern California murders especially difficult to investigate was the apparent randomness of the killer's target selection, at least on the surface. Victims lived in different cities, different types of neighborhoods, and had no obvious connection to one another beyond broad demographic similarities. Some were newlyweds. Others were established couples who had lived in the same home for years. The killer showed no discernible preference for a particular type of house or a particular time of year, making it nearly impossible for local police to issue the kind of specific, actionable warning that might have helped residents protect themselves. Investigators in this period also faced a structural problem that would continue to hamper the case for years afterward. Without a national, computerized system for comparing crime scene details across jurisdictions, a murder in Goleta and a murder in Irvine, separated by a few hundred miles and different police departments, could easily go uncompared for years, even when the underlying forensic evidence, examined side by side, would have told an obvious story. The final murder attributed to the Golden State Killer took place in Irvine, California, in May of 1986. After that, as abruptly and inexplicably as his earliest attacks had begun a decade earlier, the killings simply stopped. No arrest explained the sudden end. No death was ever confirmed. Investigators were left with a chilling, open-ended question that would define the case for the next several decades. Had the man responsible died, been imprisoned for some unrelated crime, or was he still out there, indistinguishable from everyone else, having simply decided, for reasons nobody could explain, to stop? The abrupt end to the killings in 1986 left investigators with almost nothing new to work from for years afterward. Without fresh crime scenes, there was no new evidence to analyze, no updated witness statements to gather, and no obvious next step beyond periodically re-examining a file that had already been studied exhaustively. For the families of victims, and for survivors of his assaults, that silence brought its own particular kind of unresolved dread. Many spent years wondering whether the man responsible was living peacefully somewhere nearby, whether he had died anonymously, or whether, worst of all, he might simply start again without warning. Some survivors later described spending decades looking over their shoulders, installing security systems, and remaining permanently unable to fully relax in their own homes, never knowing whether the person responsible for the worst night of their lives might, at any moment, decide to return. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, investigators periodically revisited the case, applying whatever new forensic technology had become available since the last review, always coming up short. Thousands of men were investigated and cleared over the years, some based on tips from the public, others based on circumstantial similarities to the killer's known behavioral patterns. Advances in standard forensic DNA testing during the 1990s allowed investigators to build an increasingly precise genetic profile of the unknown offender. But that profile, however detailed, was useless without a matching sample already sitting in a database somewhere, and the man responsible had never once been arrested for anything that would have required submitting his DNA. In 2016, the FBI announced a $50,000 reward for information leading to an arrest, part of a renewed, coordinated push to bring fresh national attention and resources to a case that had by then gone unsolved for 3 decades. Author Michelle McNamara, who had spent years investigating the case independently, corresponding with retired detectives, poring over old case files, and building relationships with investigators still working the case, had coined the Golden State Killer name that would eventually become permanently attached to it, was working on a book about the case when she died unexpectedly in her sleep in April of 2016. Before she ever learned the killer's real identity. Her death came as a profound shock to the small community of investigators, researchers, and survivors who had come to rely on her tireless, independent research. Her book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, was completed posthumously with help from her research partners, journalist Billy Jensen and investigator Paul Haynes, and published the following year, becoming a bestseller and reigniting widespread public interest in a case that many had assumed would never be solved. The break that finally cracked the case did not come from a traditional police investigation at all. It came from a retired patent attorney with a passion for genealogy. In 2017 and 2018, investigator Paul Holes, who had personally worked on the case for years and had grown increasingly convinced that a genealogical approach might succeed where traditional investigative methods had not, and Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert began working with genetic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter, a retired patent attorney with a scientific background and no formal law enforcement experience whatsoever, who had built a reputation identifying unknown biological relatives for adoptees and others researching their family trees. Investigators uploaded the killer's crime scene DNA profile to GED Match, a free, publicly accessible genealogy database where users voluntarily share their genetic information in hopes of finding relatives. Unlike major commercial services such as Ancestry or 23andMe, which required a court order before sharing data with law enforcement, GEDmatch's open structure meant investigators could search it directly without needing anyone's specific permission, a legal and ethical gray area that would later spark significant public debate about privacy and consent once the technique became widely known. Using distant genetic matches found on the platform, Ray Venter built out an enormous family tree, working backward through generations of relatives the killer had never met, some connections stretching back well over a century, gradually narrowing an initially vast pool of possible suspects down to a small handful of men who fit the right branch of the family. A genetic marker on the crime scene profile even indicated the suspect likely had blue eyes, a detail that helped narrow the list even further, down to just one man who matched every single criterion investigators had assembled. That man was Joseph James DeAngelo. The use of genetic genealogy to identify DeAngelo represented a genuinely new approach to criminal investigation, one that had never before been used to crack a case of this scale and notoriety. Rather than searching for a direct match to the suspect's own DNA, which would have required his profile to already exist somewhere in a criminal database, Ray Venter's method worked by finding distant cousins, third and fourth cousins in some cases, who happened to have voluntarily uploaded their own DNA for entirely unrelated reasons, usually simple curiosity about their family history. From those distant genetic threads, she was able to reconstruct branching family trees spanning multiple generations, cross-referencing birth records, marriage certificates, obituaries, and other public genealogical documents, until the branches converged on a small number of living men whose age, geography, and family history all lined up with what investigators already knew about the killer. It was painstaking, meticulous work, closer to advanced historical research than anything typically associated with a criminal investigation, and it took months of careful effort before a single name finally emerged from the tangle of family connections. Joseph James DeAngelo was, by 2018, a 72-year-old retired mechanic living a completely unremarkable life in Citrus Heights, a quiet suburb of Sacramento. What made his identification so unsettling to investigators who had spent decades chasing this case was his own background. From 1973 to 1976, DeAngelo had worked as a police officer in Exeter, California. On September 11, 1975, while serving as an officer, he shot and killed a college professor named Claude Snelling outside his home in nearby Visalia, an attack investigators would only later connect to him decades afterward. From 1976 to 1979, D'Angelo worked as a police officer in Auburn, California, meaning that for a significant portion of his known crime spree, the man committing dozens of home invasions, assaults, and eventually murders across the state had at the very same time been a sworn law enforcement officer himself, trained in exactly the investigative and forensic techniques that had made him so difficult to catch. D'Angelo was fired from the Auburn Police Department in 1979 after being caught shoplifting a can of dog repellent and a hammer from a local drugstore, a minor, almost absurd offense that ended his law enforcement career at almost exactly the same time his known crime spree was reaching its most violent phase. After his firing, he moved into private life entirely, eventually working as a truck mechanic for a grocery distribution company for decades, marrying, raising 3 daughters, and living, by every outward appearance, an ordinary suburban life. His marriage reportedly ended in separation years before his arrest, though the couple never formally divorced, and his now adult daughters, like most of the people who had known him for decades, expressed shock and disbelief when his arrest was announced. Identifying a likely suspect through genetic genealogy was not, on its own, enough to make an arrest. Investigators needed direct, verifiable DNA evidence linking D'Angelo himself to the crime scenes. Detectives began covertly surveilling D'Angelo for weeks, watching his home, his routines, and his movements around Citrus Heights, all while taking extreme care not to alert him to the fact that he had become the primary focus of a criminal investigation after 4 decades of anonymity. They eventually recovered a tissue from his trash left out for collection, and separately obtained a sample from the door handle of his car during a moment when it was parked in a public area. DNA extracted from both items was compared against the crime scene profile investigators had been carrying for decades, a profile built from evidence collected before some of the investigators working the case had even been born. The match was confirmed. Investigators chose the timing of D'Angelo's arrest carefully, waiting for a moment when he would be alone, away from public areas, to minimize any risk of an incident during the operation. When deputies finally moved in at his Citrus Heights home, the arrest itself was reportedly brief and without incident, a strikingly quiet, anticlimactic end to a case that had generated so much fear and speculation over so many decades. For the investigators who had spent months, and in some cases years, working toward this exact moment, the arrest represented the culmination of a case many of them had never truly expected to see solved in their careers. Several who worked the investigation later described a strange, disorienting sense of relief mixed with disbelief, having spent so long chasing a man who had, until that morning, existed only as a set of crime scene photographs, a DNA profile, and a decades-old nickname. On April 24, 2018, Sacramento County Sheriff's deputies arrested Joseph James D'Angelo at his home in Citrus Heights. The arrest made headlines across the country within hours. For decades, the Golden State Killer had existed only as a composite sketch, a nickname, and an ever-growing list of unsolved crimes. Now, for the first time, there was a face, a name, and a mundane, unremarkable life story attached to one of the most notorious unsolved cases in American history. Neighbors and former co-workers, interviewed by reporters in the days that followed, consistently described D'Angelo as an unremarkable, sometimes gruff man. Nothing about him, in their experience, had ever suggested he was capable of what investigators now said he had done. News of D'Angelo's arrest spread quickly beyond California, drawing national and even international media attention. For anyone old enough to remember the original wave of attacks in the 1970s and 80s, the news carried a strange, disorienting weight. An unsolved terror from their own youth, one many had assumed would remain a mystery forever, had suddenly, unexpectedly, been solved. Survivors of D'Angelo's attacks, some of whom had lived with the fear and unidentified attacker for more than 40 years, described a complicated mix of emotions upon hearing the news. Relief, certainly, but also a resurfacing of trauma many had spent decades trying to move past. Several survivors and family members of victims later said that seeing his face for the first time, ordinary and unremarkable, was almost harder to process than the uncertainty of not knowing had been. Prosecutors ultimately charged D'Angelo with 13 counts of first-degree murder, along with numerous additional charges connected to kidnapping and sexual assault cases spanning multiple California counties. Investigators eventually attributed at least 13 murders and more than 50 sexual assaults to him across his 12-year crime spree, though many involved in the case have said they believe the true number of his victims, particularly from his earliest and least documented attacks, may never be fully known. Because the statute of limitations had long since expired on most of his sexual assault cases, D'Angelo could only be formally charged with the murders, along with a small number of kidnapping charges tied directly to some of those killings. Prosecutors from multiple counties agreed to consolidate the case, allowing D'Angelo to be tried once for the full scope of his crimes, rather than face a fragmented series of separate proceedings across different jurisdictions. Prosecuting a case spanning 12 years, more than a dozen murders, and dozens of sexual assaults across multiple counties presented enormous logistical challenges rarely seen in American criminal justice. Evidence had to be pulled from decades-old, sometimes poorly preserved case files, some stored in facilities that had changed hands, moved locations, or nearly discarded material assumed permanently unusable. Prosecutors from Sacramento, Orange, Ventura, Santa Barbara, and Contra Costa counties coordinated an unusual joint effort, recognizing that no single county's evidence on its own would necessarily be enough to guarantee a conviction, but that the combined weight of the case across all of them made an overwhelming argument for D'Angelo's guilt. It represented one of the most complex, multi-jurisdictional prosecutions in California history, requiring cooperation between offices that, in many cases, had never previously worked together on a single case. Facing overwhelming DNA evidence and the very real possibility of a death sentence, D'Angelo's defense team negotiated a plea agreement with prosecutors. On June 29, 2020, D'Angelo pleaded guilty to all 13 counts of first-degree murder, along with additional charges connected to kidnapping, formally taking responsibility, in a court of law, for crimes investigators had spent 42 years trying to solve. In exchange, prosecutors agreed to take the death penalty off the table, and D'Angelo was guaranteed a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. As part of the agreement, D'Angelo also admitted, in detail and on the record, to numerous additional sexual assaults that fell outside the statute of limitations and could never have been separately prosecuted, providing survivors of those earlier attacks with a form of formal acknowledgement the legal system otherwise would never have given them. For many of those survivors, some of whom had spent decades believing their own attacks would never be officially connected to the larger case, or acknowledged by anyone in a position of legal authority, this admission carried a weight that went beyond the murder convictions alone. In August of 2020, D'Angelo's sentencing hearing stretched across multiple days, giving dozens of surviving victims and family members of those he had killed the opportunity to address him directly in court for the first time. D'Angelo, then 74 years old, sat through most of the proceedings in a wheelchair, wearing a face mask, appearing frail and largely unresponsive, as victim after victim described in painstaking detail exactly how his crimes had shaped the rest of their lives. Marriages that ended, decades of anxiety and hypervigilance, physical injuries that never fully healed, and, for the families of those he killed, a lifetime spent without the people he took from them. Then, near the end of the proceedings, in a moment nobody watching had fully expected, he rose from the wheelchair, removed his mask, and addressed the court directly. "I've listened to all your statements, each one of them," D'Angelo said. and I'm truly sorry to everyone I have hurt. Among those who gave statements was a woman named Bonnie, who had been engaged to D'Angelo decades earlier, long before any of his known crimes had been publicly connected to him, and who had broken off their relationship years before his identity as the Golden State Killer was ever revealed. Her presence in that courtroom, confronting a man she had once nearly married, captured just how deeply ordinary D'Angelo's life had appeared to nearly everyone who had ever known him. D'Angelo was formally sentenced to multiple consecutive terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Perhaps nothing about D'Angelo's case unsettled investigators, survivors, and the public more than the sheer ordinariness of his double life. Co-workers at the grocery distribution warehouse where he spent decades working as a mechanic described him as a competent, if occasionally difficult, employee, prone to angry outbursts over small workplace disputes, but nothing that set off any real alarm. He coached youth sports. He attended neighborhood gatherings. He lived for more than 4 decades after his last known crime in the same general region where he had once terrorized entire communities, going about an unremarkable daily routine that gave absolutely no outward indication of the violence in his past. It is precisely this quality, the profound, sustained gap between his public and private selves, that continues to make his case one of the most studied examples of criminal concealment in modern law enforcement history. Looking back across the full span of the investigation, the delay in identifying D'Angelo comes down to a combination of circumstances that, individually, might seem minor, but that combined to protect him for over 4 decades. His crimes were originally split across so many different jurisdictions, investigated by so many separate police departments, that even connecting his Northern California assaults to his Southern California murders took investigators more than 2 decades to formally confirm. His background as a former police officer meant he understood, better than almost any other offender investigators had ever pursued, exactly what evidence to avoid leaving behind. And because he had never been arrested for any offense serious enough to require a DNA sample, his genetic profile had simply never appeared in any law enforcement database investigators had access to for most of the case's history. It took an entirely new technology, one that had nothing to do with criminal investigation when it was first developed, and one dedicated genealogist willing to spend months building out a family tree spanning multiple generations to finally close the one gap that had protected him for 42 years. Joseph James D'Angelo remains incarcerated today, serving multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole at a California state prison, where he is expected to remain for whatever time he has left. The investigative technique that finally identified him, now widely known as investigative genetic genealogy, went on to become one of the most significant developments in modern criminal investigation, subsequently used to help identify suspects and victims in hundreds of other previously unsolved cases across the country, from decades-old murders to unidentified human remains, permanently changing the landscape of what investigators consider possible when a case has otherwise run out of leads. Barbara Ray Venter went on to become one of the most sought-after experts in the field, later publishing her own account of the investigation and continuing to work on other previously unsolvable cases in the years that followed. Michelle McNamara, whose independent research and popular true crime writing helped keep public attention on the case during some of its coldest years, did not live to see D'Angelo's arrest, having died 2 years before investigators finally identified him. Her book remains one of the most widely read accounts of the case, a testament to years spent chasing a man whose real identity turned out to be almost aggressively ordinary. Investigators who worked closely with her have said, in the years since, that they wished more than anything she could have been there to see the case finally solved. For more than 4 decades, an entire region of California lived with an unanswered question. Who was doing this? And would he ever come back? The answer, when it finally arrived, was almost more unsettling than the uncertainty itself. Not a stranger from somewhere else, not someone who had fled the state or the country, but a former police officer who had spent the rest of his life quietly working, raising a family, and living, as far as anyone around him ever knew, an entirely unremarkable life just a short drive from where it had all begun. He had been close enough, for over 40 years, that investigators searching for him could easily have driven past his house without ever knowing it.